Yeah.
Now, what does John say about Jesus as a star? Well, he definitely upsets, the demonic forces. He, absolutely, defeats Satan at the end. But the interesting thing as well to note in Revelation 12, where it seems to be depicting the birth of Jesus, I don't think that's the birth of Jesus.
Really?
It's the rebirth.
Explain.
When Jesus became the Son of God, according to Paul in Romans 1:14, he became the Son of God because of his resurrection from the dead.
Oh.
Jesus is born again.
So what was his? What was he? How was he? He wasn't alive. He was alive before that. Then you're saying?
So if you, it's worth noting, like before you get to Revelation 12, you have all these descriptions of the lamb who had been sacrificed, whose neck was broken, who was bleeding, and then does all these rituals within the holy temple as sin sacrifice. In other words, doing the Yom Kippur ritual as the lamb who had been slain.
Oh,
Everything up to Revelation 12 looks like Jesus has already died,
that's true. Okay.
and now he's performing the final rituals in the Holy of Holies before emerging. And it's also worth noting, in Hebrews, it's specific and says that Jesus entered the temple only one time entered the holy temple, the heavenly temple, to offer his blood for sacrifice, and then left that forever. What happens in Revelation 11? The temple in heaven blows open. Then you see the woman giving birth after Jesus had already done all these other sacrifice things. I think the imagery here is not the birth of Jesus, because why is Jesus being born at the moon? But this is being resurrected and ascending in heaven.
Okay, I get what you're saying now. It makes a lot of sense, actually.
Yeah, so I think that fits Revelation and the imagery there, and like Paul's theology, what's said in the Epistle of the Hebrews, it fits that context, I think, overall better. It's also then a bit weird if it were actually the birth of Jesus, because according to, for example, Ignatius, the birth of Jesus was hidden from Satan. In Revelation 12, Satan clearly knows what's up. He is trying to devour the child that's about to be born. That's definitely not hidden.
Yeah.
On the other hand, Ignatius says the way that Jesus became known was by becoming this bright star and upsetting all of heaven. So to me, I'm looking at this and saying, hey, it's the same myth. It's about the resurrected Jesus as a star.
Right.
You also find the same thing in the Ascension of Isaiah, that when Jesus is descending, he has to hide himself and look comely as a human. But after his death, when he comes back to life, he will no longer look like a human. He will transform back into his much more elegant, angelic, stellar body.
Okay. Makes sense.
So this seems to be what is the common myth, that it seems like Revelation Ignatius have some sort of underlying source or theology where Jesus becomes a star or appears as a star, and specifically the morning star, at his resurrection. And then in that he upsets the demonic powers and basically brings the end of the world eventually. And also, again, all those other studies suggesting that Revelation and Matthew have a common source. Ignatius and Matthew have a common source. If this source is in common with Revelation and Matthew, or sorry, in Revelation and Ignatius, and these two sources seem to have common sources with Matthew, that ups the probability a lot that Matthew could be using the exact same source as well for his story.
So are you hinting at a Q type of thing or a Mark?
So it'd be more Q in that case, because it's not derived from Mark.
Okay. I'll give you.
Yeah. Though the big difference is, unlike Q, where it's reconstruction based on arguments whether Matthew knew Luke or not, in these cases, I'm building on the other studies that do suggest that Revelation and Ignatius aren't using Matthew, may not even know the Gospel of Matthew, but since they have these commonalities, they must have some sort of common theological source behind there.
Okay.
So, and like I say, these studies were mostly independent on the whole Jesus as star story. It's many other quotes that they look to and say similarities, but not common sourcing.
Gotcha.
So, building on that, it makes it seem like, okay, if Revelation and Ignatius are telling the same story about Jesus as a morning star upsetting, demonic forces, could Matthew be deriving from that as well? Now, obviously, Matthew's story is very different, but I think he kind of gives the game away. And it's a phrase that honestly I had ignored for the longest time until I realized how it's actually important. The Magi, when they are coming, they say they have seen his star at its rising or at its morning rising.
There's that
His
coin that I was
star.
showing.
Oh yeah, we got some coins, of course. Now, oh yeah,
That's Venus. That's the
Mhm.
8-pointed star of Venus. By the
Right.
way, a lot of the coins that are also the same as this have the 2 that are lateral too. Or I'm sorry,
Mhm.
horizontal, I mean. I said lateral.
Yeah.
So they have the whole 8s. In this particular one, it's the Divius Ilius that is the,
Mhm.
horizontal ones. But yeah, oh yeah, you can see them up there.
Yep, I have a collection of their. Some of them are for Julius Caesar, and some of them are for Caesar Augustus,
Augustus, right.
where he also is divinized as a star.
Yeah. And by the way, this is I just found this out. At the Vatican, there is an Egyptian obelisk from Egypt that they brought. They literally took this thing all the way from Egypt. Must have
Mhm.
been an insane job to do that. To try not to break this thing. Anyways, they did it, and the obelisk is sitting in the middle of St. Peter's Square, has on it the divine Julius, the son divine Ilias, or divine Augustus, or I think it says Octavian or something. Anyways, it's got divine Julius, divine Octavian, and then the son of the son Tiberius, son of God. So Tiberius is now the son of God in that time period. He's the one who brought, and the story goes that Julius Caesar is the one who went to the Battle of Actium. No, no, not the Battle of Actium. Augustus, Battle of Actium, defeats Mark Antony and Cleopatra. He finds that obelisk, says this is now Rome's obelisk, but he doesn't take it back right away. He leaves it in Egypt for like 60 years or something like that. Tiberius is the one who goes and brings it back to Rome, puts it in front of the Vatican. And then later on, there's a legend that I don't think is true. I don't think anyone even believes it. But the story is that St. Peter was hung on that obelisk. The cross that he was killed on was on that obelisk. So it's like, that's just, think about all the things that tie into this. The rock of the church. So you got an obelisk. You have Peter getting getting crucified on this obelisk. It's from Egypt. I don't know. There's a lot of weird thoughts that come to my head when I think of this. But I don't think Peter actually did get killed on that thing. I think it's just a later legend.
Yeah, I would probably guess that's a later legend too. But the idea, of course, Peter being the rock and he's hung from this rock obelisk. It seems like the sort of
Where the church is,
poetic
by the
death.
way. Yeah, it just
Yeah,
happens to be where the church is, the Vatican.
yeah. It seems like that's like how such a myth would be created. Somebody
Exactly.
starts with basically a pun, and then the pun becomes real.
Yes, I think a lot of Christian stories are brought up that way.
Hmm. Oh yes, yes. All right, all right. Oh, so yeah, calling the Star of Bethlehem his star, the star of Jesus. The thing that set me off, and I realized there was something weird there because that's not something you would see in something in astrology. In an astrological text, it never talks about a person having a star in their horoscope or the point to a star and say that this is, this person's or that person's star per se. This is actually rather weird. And the examples of where I find this particular construction of talking about like saying this is the star of this person or this is his or her star, I could only find a couple examples of that when it comes to people. One of them is with Julius Caesar, the star that's seen after his death. It is called Caesar's star. In Virgil's Aeneid, it's called the star of the father because it's talking about Augustus. So this is the star of his father, Julius Caesar.
And by the way, when you read Ovid's Metamorphosis, he makes it clear that Julius Caesar became a god, ascended into heaven. He's on his funeral pyre. He's raised up by Venus and brought onto his throne. And then right then and there, because of his will, the will of Julius Caesar is to beget his son, who is Octavian. So Augustus is begotten by God.
Mm-hmm. Now, the thing also worth noting, all these times that they're talking about Caesar's star or his star, it's also worth noting, remember that according to the Roman propaganda, that star wasn't just a star to represent Caesar, that star was Caesar. That was his soul ascending
Yes.
to heaven.
Yes. Yep. That's crazy.
And if you go about 150 or so years later, you find another figure named Antinous. This was a young lover of the Emperor Hadrian.
Yes.
And on
He
a
was
trip,
deified. He was deified too.
yep, yeah. The basic story was he was taking a pleasure trip with Hadrian on the Nile in Egypt. Somehow he falls into the Nile and drowns, and Hadrian is just so distraught. He's being comforted by like the priests that are with him, and they say, "Look up! We see that there's a new star in the sky. That's Antinous' soul rising to heaven. He's become a god."
Wow.
And again, the construction there, it refers to that star as the star of Antinous. It uses this same sort of construction to say it was star of this person. But again, according to our sources like Cassius Dio, that star was said to actually be the soul of Antinous.
Wow.
So when you see someone say his star, that should make you think that person is that star.
Right.
You also find the same thing if we go back to Jewish literature. So in the Testament of Levi, it talks also about this bright star who's supposed to be the high priest that's going to, bring all the good things to the world. And again, it referred to as his star, the star of the priest. The priest is this bright star, and that is the star of the priest. So when you say his star or the star of that person, you are saying that star is the person. This is also the common interpretation of Numbers 24:17. It's clearly talking about a king or Messiah figure there, and that's how it's understood in the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's how it was understood in the Bar Kokhba revolt. The star in that prophecy is a person. So if the star prophecy is, behind what's going on here, if everyone thinks, Matthew is using the star prophecy, but the star is supposed to be a person, then it really seems to be ringing all the bells to say when it says the star of Jesus, it's saying the star is Jesus, which some Christians actually did interpret that.
Sure. Why not?
So this is kind of giving away the game that Matthew is deriving from this earlier source that has Jesus as the bright morning star.
Makes sense.
Yeah, so it looks like, Revelation and Ignatius are both talking about a bright morning star upsetting the cosmic balance. In Matthew's story, there's a bright morning star that is supposed to be the star of Jesus, and of course it causes all sorts of consternation when the Magi show up.
Sure.
So to me, it looks like it's the same source being used in all these three places. So I think the model on the left is the most conformant with the studies on the relationship between Matthew, Revelation, and Ignatius. And as for 2 Peter, which also mentions Jesus as the morning star, I am very sure that 2 Peter knows the Gospels because he's basically quoting from the Transfiguration story. So he almost certainly knows the Gospel of Matthew. And the fact that he calls Jesus the morning star, that he also cites Psalm 2 after that, just like John of Patmos did, I would say more likely than not, 2 Peter is also using Revelation as inspiration, if not a source.
Makes sense.
So this, I think, then is the model that it all goes back to this earlier myth of Jesus as a star. Now, if this is true, though, this actually makes something a bit interesting. Matthew's star is clearly not acting as Jesus. It's supposed to still be separate from him, acting as his guide. So what this looks like is Matthew knows the earlier source, and now he has euhemerized it.
That's your argument, right?
Mm-hmm.
Ah, I caught you. No,
You got me.
It's a good argument, though. I like that. It makes sense. It would be big for mythicists, if this is true.
When it comes to that, there are a few things to note. I honestly don't think this changes the arguments for mythicism that much for a few reasons. One, because I'm arguing that the nativity story is even less historical, doesn't really change things because most Bible scholars already figured this isn't historical. It's not like I've proven the crucifixion didn't happen. That's not what's happened here.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah. And most importantly, I think that you could still believe that this story is euhemerized and this fits that model of taking cosmic myths and putting them on Earth, but still think there's an historical person if you think Paul is talking about an historical Jesus. Basically, the model could be that Jesus was a dude. He was effectively deified very quickly by the time Paul comes on board. Myths are created about the deified Jesus, and then the later gospel authors then start taking those myths and putting them on earth.
Sure.
This would mean the gospels have very, very little connection to the historical Jesus.
Yeah.
But it would still be consistent with there being a historical Jesus. So ultimately, this argument can't prove mythicism.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I think it does justify, for example, Richard Carey's idea that the Gospels are euhemerizations of Christ's myth. If I can show this is like one example and say, hey, here's the earlier source, we can derive it from these other non-gospel sources, and then see how Matthew has euhemerized it, then it makes it much more plausible that that's the sort of strategy the gospel authors did have. It won't prove mythicism. What it would do is just show that that premise that Carey uses is justified.